Okay, perfect. Thank you for letting us
Not
know.
good lighting here.
It's all good. I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's Interfaith program. Thank you for joining us. 1 second here. So I'd like to start every program that I do after 5 o'clock by saying thank you for allowing us to get in between you and your dinner, or if you're having dinner with us, maybe I hope it's tasty, and I hope this conversation is a good accompaniment to it. For those who aren't familiar with NCCJ, I'm Michael. I'm the program director. I'm going to be moderating tonight's conversation. And for years, NCCJ has worked to bring folks from different perspectives together to build community and celebrate their similarities and differences through events like these. Our Citation Award Dinner, our very well-known Camp Anytown, which I think you may have seen a flyer for. Some information, we are recruiting for our Anytown camp that will be happening this summer in June and July. So if you know any young people in your life who are looking for an opportunity to meet new people and have some great conversations, please let them know about Anytown. Our goal with these programs is to build our awareness and our understanding of ourselves and others. And for many folks in our community, we don't have a lot of opportunities to do these. And NCCJ has always been an organization that has been at the forefront of bringing folks, especially around conversations of interfaith issues together. For those who have been in the triad for a while, they probably remember NCCJ before it was a National Conference for Community and Justice, when it was a National Conference of Christians and Jews. And so tonight's program is in the vein of continuing to bring folks together from different religious perspectives to talk about issues that we face in our community. So tonight, I am very, very pleased to welcome two of my favorite people, Naijla Faizi, the Associate Chaplain for Muslim Life at Wake Forest University, and Rabbi Andy Koren, who is joining us from Poland tonight. He's on a bus currently, but will be in a stationary location, hopefully arriving safely to a stationary location in a few moments. So tonight's session is going to be focusing on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Many of the programs that we do, in a moment, I'm going to have Naijla and Andy introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their roles and things like that. But I want to say up front that both Rabbi Andy and Naijla are they're practitioners. They are leaders in their respective communities, but they are not monolithic representatives of their faith, and they don't speak for everybody who is a member of their faith community. So we have a portion during tonight's session for Q&A, and I ask you to be respectful in your line of questions and recognize that these individuals are speaking from their individual perspective. So I encourage you to listen deeply, to challenge yourself, and be willing to listen with open ears and hearts tonight. So also, before we dive in, I want to just acknowledge that we are where I'm sitting, joining tonight's call from the ancestral lands of the Eno, Saponi, Okanichi, and Sissipaha Native tribes. In conversation, especially anytime we're having conversations about topics of discrimination and exclusion, and it's important for us to recognize that these are not isolated incidents, right? We are part of a legacy where this is a part of our narrative as America. So we must lift up those who came before us, who allow us to, whose sacrifice allow us to be able to sit here and have these conversations in comfortable settings. With that, I'm going to give some space for our friends, Naijla and Rabbi Andy, to introduce themselves. And while you introduce yourself, can you tell us a little bit about your role in your organization? And as we like to do, so for some people, this might be the first time they've actually held space with folks from who practice Islam or Judaism. And so can you give us in like a really high level overview of Islam and Judaism? I know that's like give me a high level overview of of a faith that millions of people practice and have existed for thousands of years. Can you do that in about 5 minutes, please?
I guess we'll be up to the challenge, Michael, whether we want to or not. So hi everyone. As Michael said, my name is Naijla. I have a silent J in my name. I am from North Carolina, as in I was born here. I was raised here. I've lived here pretty much my whole life. My family immigrated to the US from Pakistan, and my grandfather was an economics professor at High Point University, then college. And so we've been in the Triad area, for a couple of generations. I'm currently the associate chaplain for Muslim life at Wake Forest University, which is in Winston-Salem. And one of my primary responsibilities is to provide programming support for our Muslim students. So an example of that right now, it's Ramadan. So, it's my job to make sure that the dining hall hours are extended, that Muslim students have food early in the morning and late in the evening for their fasting, making sure that, Friday prayers are happening weekly, that holy day services are planned and executed on campus. But as a chaplain, my job is also to provide pastoral care and support to our larger campus community. So that includes all faculty, staff, and students, regardless of any sort of religious or non-faith background. And so, that looks like people reaching out to talk or get support or just have someone that they can kind of bounce things off of if they're struggling or anything like that. Okay, to Michael's really easy question about narrowing down, this religion in a matter of a few minutes. I will definitely not be able to do that. I'm pretty, open about saying I'm not a scholar of Islam. I'm mostly a practitioner of Islam, but, I work in the capacity of being a sort of a leader on campus. So obviously educating about Islam is one of the things that comes with my job, but high level. So this is what I'll say. Islam in America in particular is the most racially and ethnically diverse religious group. So there's no one ethnic or racial group within our umbrella in the US that acts as a majority over another. So I say that to let people know that the ways in which people will practice Islam, what that looks like, how it shows up, their interpretations of, doctrine, religious text is going to be different and is contextual for their racial, cultural, ethnic backgrounds. But broadly speaking, there are 5 pillars of Islam that pretty much generally all Muslims abide by. There are different ways of interpreting some of them, but generally speaking, we can all agree on these 5 pillars. The first one is the Shahada. This is the witness. This is essentially like when someone converts to Islam, they would say, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his servant and his messenger. And so this is the first pillar of Islam, is to make that declaration of faith. The second is prayer. There are 5 distinct prayers in Islam that are based on different times of the day. Some Muslims will pray these prayers 3 times a day, and other Muslims will pray them 5 times a day. But those are generally how the prayers work. Third, there is charity. So in Islam, there's something called zakat, which is a 2.5% payment to any sort of, it can either be a Muslim organization, you could just give it to someone that you know that's in need, based on your assets. So not just like what's in my bank account. It's really a calculation of things that you might own, incorporating any debts that you might have, that sort of thing. So that's a complex system. We'll sideline that. Charity is very important in Islam. The 4th pillar of Islam is fasting, which is the month that we're in right now, the month of Ramadan, 9th month of the Muslim calendar. We follow a lunar calendar. And so fasting during this month is prescribed in the Quran. It's talked about in terms of this lineage and history of fasting for people that came before us. So there's a lot of reference to fasting that exists in other faiths. And that's, one of the reasons why God has commanded us to be fasting during this month. And fasting in Ramadan looks like not eating or drinking, not even water, from dawn. So from when the sun first starts to peak all the way until sunset. And the last final pillar of Islam is the pilgrimage to Mecca, which is called the Hajj. You've probably seen this on TV or the news during Hajj time when there's like people circling what looks like this black cube box. So also sideline all of those things for another conversation another day, but that's the general gist.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Naijla. You did a good job with that, actually. Sideline. There's a lot of tangents to those
yeah,
pillars.
when I think about it, I'm like, okay, should I explain this? But there's going to be questions. So I'm like, no, I don't have time for this. Yes. Turn my brain off.
Google is our friend in these moments, folks. Rabbi Andy, how are you, brother?
Hey, everybody. Great to see you, Michael, and great to see you, Naijla. And let me just start by saying to everybody, as it was mentioned before, I'm in Poland right now. I spent part of the day at the Polish border with Western Ukraine. That, if you want to sideline that conversation for another time, I'm happy to talk more, and I hope I'm coming in clearly. But Naijla, let me just say from your Jewish brothers and sisters, Ramadan Mubarak, Ramadan Kareem. We just hope that this is a blessed time for you and for all of our friends in the Muslim community. I'll start just by saying a few things. I am an ordained rabbi. I'm in my 29th year as a rabbi, and my 19th year in Greensboro, which makes me, relative to Naijla, a newcomer to North Carolina. Actually, I've spent over 20 years in North Carolina because for 2 years I was the campus rabbi at the University of North Carolina, and that goes back a long, long time. So I just really feel that North Carolina is a home, and Greensboro in particular, where I serve as the senior rabbi now of Temple Emanuel, Greensboro. Temple Emanuel started in 1907, so we're coming up on our 115th anniversary, and we have been one of the central voices not only for Judaism in our area for the long term, but also for interfaith interactions and relations. And again, it's just an honor to be here. NCCJ's office is actually on the campus of our historic building in downtown, the downtown Greensboro area. Having said that, let's just take a quick dive, because I just started as the senior rabbi of Temple, having served for 18 years as the director of education for our congregation. And we are part of the reform movement of Judaism, which places us, I think, religiously more on the liberal side, the more I would just say, lenient side of interpretation. It has nothing to do with American politics per se. But we are affiliated with the Reform movement of Judaism. I just started as the senior rabbi of our congregation, having served in educational capacity, as I said, for the better part of 18 years. So I just want to say this about Judaism. And I love, by the way, in presentations where I've been with Muslims, when they go first, because I can give some of the framing of Judaism based on the 5 pillars of Islam, although most Jews would not be familiar with this framing. Judaism, in essence, goes back 4,000 years. If you're familiar with the story of Abraham and Sarah and their revolution, that instead of for the thousands of blessings we may have on any given day, that there would be thousands of gods, their revolution, Abraham and Sarah, was that if you've got multiple blessings, it all comes back to one source, namely one God. So let's put it in the framing that we had before. Yes, we have a central declaration in Judaism. It comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and it declares one God. So there's that. When it comes to prayer, Islam, it has 5 times of prayer a day. Judaism has 3 times of prayer a day within traditional communities. A evening prayer to start the new day, because the new day begins as the sun sets. A morning prayer when you get up in the morning, and then an afternoon prayer. If you're in traditional communities, that's a familiar pattern. If you are in more liberal communities like we are, you might find that less to be the case, but that's the traditional framework. Charity. Listen, part of what I did today was to answer one of humanity's highest calls, but also Judaism's highest calls, which is to be someone who dedicates part of what they do in life to giving, right? We are not judged on what we have, but we would be judged by what we give. And so zakat makes perfect sense within the context of Judaism. We call it tzedakah. When we talk about fasting, so a month of fasting within Islam, Judaism sees this as something that we do at different times, but most notably once a year for a 25-hour period that we call the Day of Atonement. And again, it's not about, I feel like I've got to go on a intermittent fast because that would be a healthy thing to do, but this is about spiritual health and spiritual growth. And the last thing I would do in that framework would be to talk about Hajj, right, a pilgrimage. And for many Jewish people, although this is not something that's encoded for us, to at least visit the land of Israel and the holy city of Jerusalem once in our lifetime would be a very high calling. The other thing I like about the Arabic word Hajj is that it's very similar to the Hebrew word Chag. In Hebrew, and I think they're from the same Semitic roots, Chag means a holiday or a celebration. In fact, we have one that is starting this Friday night, namely the holiday of Passover, in which we really revisit the central narrative of the Jewish people, which I should say is not God's oneness, that's a given, but that we were once slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and now we are free. Even in difficult times, we come back to that freedom, and we say that we are not fully free until all people can enjoy such freedom. So I'm going to go on mute right now because I think the bus I'm on right now may be a little bit loud, but I'm glad that we could have that type of opening framing, and I'll be listening, and I'll be back, I'm sure, soon.
Awesome. Thank you both for sharing that. Our interfaith programs, as I mentioned earlier, in the past have focused primarily on that. The tenets, the foundations of the faith, things that guide people's practice. But we're finding, and because we had to do a shift in the last year, the pandemic gave us an opportunity to explore some ideas and raise our community's awareness around things that we don't always get to discuss when we're doing interfaith conversations. Usually it kind of centers around the unity piece of interfaith. But tonight's session, we're going to be talking specifically about the impact of discrimination and hatred on those that practice particular faiths. And I appreciate you all being part of the conversation for this. I think it's no secret that every faith tradition in some way, shape, or form is subject to discrimination. But when you look at the statistics around who is targeted the most, especially just in the United States, Judaism and Islam make up 3/4 of all the incidents that are being investigated for hate crimes and discrimination in the United States by the FBI. And just to put that in context, folks, in context, Islam and Judaism, folks who identify as being Muslim or Jewish, make up only 2% of the US population, so 1% each, about roughly 1% each, right? So you imagine that too. Think about all the faith traditions that are practiced here in the United States, land of religious freedom, the one with two of the smallest populations in the United States are getting 75% of the discrimination and hate based on their faith tradition, okay? So I would venture to say that folks who are on the call tonight may not be unfamiliar with anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, but I wanted to hear from your perspective, can you define or describe anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and kind of place it in a historical context? I think we are familiar with it. We think about the Holocaust, we think about 9/11, but what else? Surely, have these ideas existed before those moments, right? Just how would you place them in historical context?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael. So Khalid Beydoun is someone who published a book very recently about Islamophobia, and particularly Islamophobia as it relates to America. And so I'm going to really borrow his definition of Islamophobia, which is the presumption that Islam is inherently violent, it is unassimilable, and it's alien, right? It's foreign to us, which is driven by the belief that expressions of Muslim identity correlate with a propensity for terrorism. And he really expounds on this by talking about 3 dimensions of Islamophobia. And so I'll go into those a little bit. And if you see me kind of sliding my eyes, it's because I'm looking at my notes. But essentially, so one is private Islamophobia. This is the fear, suspicion, violent targeting of Muslims by private actors. So this could be individuals or institutions, which is not directly tied to the state. So examples of private Islamophobia are like if someone says that like you're a dirty Muslim, or hate crimes that we've seen where like an individual has targeted a Muslim or a mosque community in some sort of violent way. Other examples of private Islamophobia are also like particular news networks that might promote stereotypes, assumptions, or misrepresentations about Muslims. This is also an example of private Islamophobia. The second type of Islamophobia that he describes is structural Islamophobia. So this is the fear and suspicion of Muslims on the part of government institution and actors, which is enforced through things like laws and policies that are built on the presumption that Muslim identity is a national security threat. So examples of structural Islamophobia are like the Patriot Act, right, which came on after 9/11, that justified the spying of Muslims and really legalized it. And now there are conversations about privacy and spying on white Christian Americans who might be perpetuating domestic terrorism. And the surveillance of them has been justified now under the Patriot Act because of something that we instituted after 9/11 against Muslims. Another example of structural Islamophobia is the Muslim ban, which a lot of people are pretty familiar with. Just like the wholesale banning of people from particular countries because of an assumption that terrorists come from those countries, when in fact, any sort of international terrorist acts that we've experienced in America were not actually from people who belong to those countries that were banned. So very confusing sort of reasoning there. Yeah. Okay, now the third type of Islamophobia is dialectical Islamophobia. Now, this is sort of the combining of structural and private Islamophobia, if folks are still following with me here. So this is the process by which structural Islamophobia shapes, reshapes, endorses views about Islam or Muslims that legitimizes the misconceptions, misrepresentations, stereotypes that emboldens private violence, right? So it's the state structurally saying, you know, for national security, Muslims are a threat to us. They're violent. Their beliefs are antithetical to our freedoms as Americans, and thus we need to surveil them. And then individual actors take this as legitimizing their own fear and their own hatred against Muslims that then might cause them to do private hate crimes, or might cause, you know, news media or other things to continue to perpetuate these really negative stereotypes. So the second part of your question was like a historical grounding. I think maybe I should if Rabbi Andy is free to jump in about anti-Semitism, then we can historically ground what we're talking about.
Well, guess what? I just got to a place where I could talk. That was a perfect toss, Naijla, and again, for a very difficult, very difficult subject, because, you know, there's a lot that we could talk about. I would say about things that are, as I did a little earlier, things that are common, and I love being in dialogue with Muslims, or for that matter, with any group. And here again, we're talking about things that can be tremendously painful for us. I'll just give you a sense of where I am today. Being in Poland, on the one hand, this mission is about providing some aid and some eyewitness to what's taking place with Ukrainians. On the other hand, I'm in the city of Krakow, Poland, which at one time was about 30% Jewish. And then as the Nazis came in, over a 2-year period, they essentially liquidated this city. And when I say that, that's just an antiseptic term for exterminating, and this was part of their plan of genocide. So let's go back, because that's a pretty high bar, right? For hatred, things like genocide and and the like, and Nazi-like anti-Semitism. There's a long history beforehand, and in fact, if folks look in their Bible, they might find elements of the roots of let's call it, of anti-Jewish feeling, because even the word anti-Semitism is a word that Jewish people did not create. I mean, it was created actually in high society circles in England and Britain in order to talk about something which was acceptable, right? And to make it even more acceptable, oh, it's not like we're hating on people, we're just being anti-Semitic. People might understand that, but that's more modern history. Things seem to be going pretty well for Jewish people in Egypt during the time that Joseph was there. Again, and I'm not looking to the Bible to be an accurate record of history, but again, it's telling a story. And then you get 8 verses into the first chapter of the book of Exodus, and it says, "There arose a Pharaoh over Egypt who did not know Joseph." And all of a sudden, it's kind of like, cue the ominous music, because within the course of just a couple of more verses, you have a Pharaoh that thinks it's a good idea to throw babies into the river and to take out a plan. Why? Because of things like fear, and because of things like misunderstanding and hatred. We see this echoed in other places in biblical sources, in particular, more than just like political intrigue. But if you take a look at the story of the book of Esther, you have a case where Jewish people are living in Persia, and again, in ancient Persia, and there was the vice chancellor of the entire state. And at one point, he's walking around. He wants everybody to bow down to him. He meets up with Mordecai, who is Esther's uncle, and Mordecai does not bow down to him. And he says, "Look, I'm Jewish. I don't bow down to any person. The only one that I bow down to is God. And instead of Haman, who is the vice chancellor, saying, well, let's throw Mordecai in jail, his answer is, let's kill all the Jews. If you haven't read the book of Esther in a while, I'm giving this to you in somewhat summary form. And if this was just, biblical references, we might understand and say, well, pretty bad characters. But we see these things occurring over and over and over again in our history. You have this, let's call it classic anti-Semitism or classic Jewish hatred based on fears. That's documented. You then have layers added to that because with the advent and the rise of Christianity, and again, one of the things that Michael said earlier is, look, some of this is going to cause us to do very difficult deep dives. Christianity kind of lends a religious angle to this at one point, and it becomes okay to hate on the Jews. Why? Because at least according to what Christianity will have in some of its teachings, not all of its teachings, is elements related to Jesus's life and death. And for a long while, Christianity blamed that death on Jewish people, Jesus having come from a Jewish background, and really teaching things which Christian sources, or at least which Christian scriptures, embed in very problematic ways with an anti-Jewish narrative. You then get Christianity combined with power, especially during the Holy Roman Empire, and things get really, really ugly. About 700 years after that, you get the Crusades, which, by the way, was an attempt to kick Muslims out of the Holy Land. But along the way, Jewish people were just a pretty convenient target, so we suffered very greatly. And then we're talking there in about the 11th and 12th centuries. Add to that religious element, by the way, I should say, not just within Christendom, but also at times, although less so, under Muslim rule, there were times that the Jews, really became the brunt of anti-Jewish feelings, relegated to second-class status in many Muslim areas, and forced to pay special taxes and to wear special hats and other things like that. But having said that, you add to this when you get into the 20th century, you add the racial dimension to it. Now, look, Judaism is as diverse as Islam. Look at maybe not, take a snapshot of Jewish communities here in North America, but if you were to see a snapshot of what Israel looks like, at least the Jewish communities in Israel, it's a full rainbow. And, Judaism is not a race, although the Nazis defined it as such. And when they added that racial dimension together with technology, things went terrible. And there was a full plan in order to kill off all the Jewish people. Look, anti-Semitism comes from the right. We know that from fascism. Anti-Semitism also comes from the left. Among the most anti-Semitic places in the world have been places that have adopted socialist teachings and other things like that. And this is not a bust on socialism. It's not a bust on communism, just to say that there are things that come up from the left side of the spectrum. And it's almost like, as a Jewish person, we have to be looking over here, and we have to be looking over here, and we have to be looking in front of us, and we have to be looking behind us, because at some point or another, someone has found at least what they consider to be a rationale to throw us under the bus. It's not fair. It's something that's very harmful. And Michael, you cited the statistic before of hate crimes. In terms of in America, that measure, if you put both of us together, it is pretty shocking. If you just isolate Judaism, I think it also accounts for the majority, so over 50% of the hate crimes, specifically on the axis when we look at religious, religious discrimination and religious attacks. Again, no one wants to win that. It's not a contest. But just to say that, this is a very serious thing, even in a place where we have experienced less harassment, incitement, and attacks than really any other place in the world. But it's still not good. I look over a winter break this year. I got a call early in the morning that a group had distributed flyers in Greensboro, blaming, actually saying COVID's a hoax and the Jews are behind it. COVID. It's like, go figure. They're like, there's any rationality to hatred, and that seems pretty I would say pretty, it's like, well, it's just hatred. I mean, it was flyers. It was pretty shocking to those who received it, Jewish people and those who are not Jewish. But again, I think we all saw on our television sets as a synagogue was taken over. It really was just by God's grace that the people taken hostage there were able to escape with their lives. It was a terrible, terrible incident, and we could go down the list of bona fide attacks, as well as murders that have taken place within our own country. Not to mention in other parts of the world. So I'm going to stop there. Naijla, I think you were going to come back. So, having, shown my face at this point, I'm going to go back on mute. But yeah, let's continue this deep dive. I think it's a very important thing.
So I'll try to be brief. Rabbi Andy, you kind of took us on like this global context of the history of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish acts and sentiments. And I was more thinking of like rooting it in the US context, because when I think of a historical context for Islamophobia, I even think like of the story of Omar ibn Said, who was an enslaved African that lived in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And really the intersection of like being an enslaved African, thinking about racism and Islamophobia and how they interacted. And so, Islamophobia in the United States dates back to when colonialists first brought enslaved Africans to this country, because, some researchers estimate like 15 to 20% of that population were Muslim. And so it's really rooted in the fabric of this nation, just like racism, just like anti-Semitism, just like other isms. And so, it's this thing that it's not foreign to the US to think these ways about Jews and Muslims and to then act on them either. It's very much part of like being American to some degree.
Thank you all so much richness in what you wrote to share. Go ahead.
And one of the things I'll say, and maybe this will touch on one of the areas that we'll go to, is that, whether it's happening overseas or it's happening here, the moments that we've reached out in order to connect with each other, I think have really made a very big difference. So, for example, to go overseas, I remember when that terrible attack took place in Christchurch, New Zealand. One of the for Friday prayers, myself and two other rabbis, Rabbi Gutman, who's now our emeritus rabbi at Temple Emanuel, and Rabbi Joshua Ben Gideon from the Beth David Synagogue. So we went over to the Islamic Center of Greensboro during prayer time, not to pray, but just to be there as a sign of solidarity. And I'll tell you, in the wake of, and I'll just be very brief on this, in the wake of the anti-Jewish flyers that were in the area, among the more important things that happened were two outreaches that came to Temple from the Muslim community, from leadership within the Muslim community. And again, that's not to say this was exclusive. We heard from many others, but it's those moments, I think, where we have really connected with one another that have been tremendously meaningful, at least for me as a Jewish person.
Thank you for that, Rabbi Andy. And solidarity goes in terms of what you both communities have to face in terms of I appreciate your description of having to look this way, that way, forward and back, in order to navigate the world anywhere you are. Very interesting. So you just mentioned, Rabbi Andy, the incident a few months ago with fires hitting different mailboxes in our community. And those who are following the news probably heard about that. And now you mentioned some other more high-profile examples of Islamophobia, on a policy level, Patriot Act, Muslim ban, right? February just marked the 7th anniversary, I believe, of the tragic killings of 3 UNC students, Muslim students. Something that has been labeled a hate crime, by many folks. And so I think when we think about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, we oftentimes will focus, I think now you mentioned this too, we'll focus on these more high profile incidences, right? But I want y'all, if you don't mind, share with us some examples of that folks may not consider, of things that folks may be doing, microaggressions, things like this that may be occurring, that you would consider are incidents of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia rearing their head.
Sure. So, I mentioned that I grew up in North Carolina. I very much see myself as being Southern. But one of the things that I have, grown up hearing or being referred to by some neighbors are like, you and your family are the good Muslims, but like the ones that are building that mosque close to our house that want to like pray all night long, those are like maybe not so great, and they could be violent or they could threaten us or something like that. So this narrative of like the good Muslim versus bad Muslim dynamic is one of those sort of insidious, minor, kind of like comments or microaggressions that someone might say. I'll also add, assuming that all Muslims are foreigners. I have many times been approached by very well-meaning people in North Carolina that will welcome me to being here. And then I have to uncomfortably proceed to explain to them that I was born in North Carolina. And then they hear my English and then they're like, wow, your English is really great. And I'm like, yes, thank you. I was raised here. I really only speak English. I don't know any other languages as fluently as I know English. There's a lot of just assumptions that have come from the news and media and images that we see about Muslims. Another one is, associating religious practice or certain types of religious piety with things like extremism. So seeing a Muslim man have like a long burly beard and assuming that like he could do something violent to you, or you see a Muslim woman who's veiled and covered and thinking like, oh, poor her, like someone needs to like go help her and explain to her that she lives in America. You can take that off. You can be fully naked if you want. And I'm like, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. But like, this is my choice. And, I identify as being a feminist also. You have your right to wear what you do and don't want, and I should have my right. We particularly see this example of like French secularism, of the forced unveiling of Muslim women. I'm grateful that that doesn't exist in the same way structurally in the United States, but on an individual level, there are still a lot of, sort of opinions and thoughts about that. Be cognizant of the stereotypes that you might have been fed by mass media. I think about recently with Afghanistan and the Afghani refugees that are going to be moving to North Carolina or have already moved. And, you might be very well-meaning in wanting to welcome them, but there are probably a lot of ways that you can engage with these populations that don't have to perpetuate stereotypes that you feel about them. Like there are plenty of Muslim women who live in these countries that are either educated, who want to continue their education, are very, very bright. We're not all like, oh, these poor, like sad Muslim women, or these super violent Muslim men, like, oh my gosh, we need to be so scared of them.
So thank you for that, Rabbi Andy.
Yeah, I think just to name some of the stereotypes and some of the things that have, that have come our way over the years. A lot of it has to do with money and with, the sense that, the Jewish people have all the money and all the power.
Those are terribly inaccurate things. And it's weird because, yeah, what happens if you are a Jewish person who's, one of many people who happens to have a little bit more money? Or what happens if you happen to be Jewish and, let's say, represent, our district in Congress, right? Which is the case for, the Greensboro area. This isn't some sort of a conspiracy or to take over. Again, it sounds like that that fear that the Pharaoh has in the Book of Exodus, that somehow or another Jews are this the secret society, the secret thing. And look, some of it becomes internalized by us and even becomes things that we've made part of our practice. For example, synagogues are not allowed to be built without windows in it. That's not an ordinance from the city of Greensboro or from the state of North Carolina or from the United States. Jewish people, we have said you can't have a synagogue without windows in it. Now, some of it is for all sorts of great reasons, right? You want to let natural light in. You want to make sure that, what's being said inside your synagogue relates to the world around you, that it's not just some sort of vacuum with no application in the world. But part of the reason that we have synagogue windows is so the world can look in on what we're doing and see, hey, this ain't so different from what you're doing in your religious institution when you pray. Right? Or sometimes the folks who have the snapshot, the Judaism of 2022 is the same as Judaism from the biblical period. In other words, that old postcard that you have of whatever, from your Bible, which is great. I mean, I'm all in favor of, paying attention to scripture and doing deep dives in on it. But Judaism has come a long, long way since antiquity and, has a pretty incredible history. And I'll say that sometimes, and I'll just kind of throw this out, although it could be a third rail in some conversations, but also, Jewish people have a phenomenal relationship, to our brothers and sisters around the world, including to the largest Jewish population in the world, which is in Israel. And yet sometimes folks will just kind of throw that at us as if it's some sort of a problem, as if the existence of the state of Israel by definition leads into all sorts of problematic things. Very often, I'm someone who has an expertise and a background in Middle East political science. Very often I'm told things from people that are just highly inaccurate, really harmful, really hurtful, using words in which they're going to define they're going to give you the definition of what it is. And then fit Israel to it, which again just doesn't reflect the reality of a place which is a very diverse, not just Jewishly, but also I would say as a crossroads of the world, which is what Israel has been from time immemorial, crossroads of the world, really reflective of that, and in some ways actually acts with a heck of a lot more sensitivity towards what we would call multiculturalism or diversity than places even down the block from where we live in Greensboro or in the High Point area or in the Winston-Salem area. I just want to put those things out because they do, kind of stack up in some of the things that we hear from time to time.
I just wanted to elevate one thing that Rabbi Andy said about the ways in which Islamophobia and anti-Semitism have been interpolated in the ways that Jews and Muslims think about themselves and then continue to act. And that's an effect of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that I think people don't always recognize. And I work, with a college campus with college-age students that are in this really important stage of discovering who they are. And I see it so blatantly, the ways in which they have internalized the things that people assume about them and then go so far in the opposite direction so as not to even be associated with like Islam or Muslims at all.
Yes, and part of what happens also because of these big gears out there. Judaism and Jewish people represent only a very small portion of the population of the world. Christianity is enormous. Islam is also enormous. But what it does, and here I'm going to speak particularly about our relations between one another. The broad swath of history, Jews and Muslims have gotten along pretty darn well. We've hit some rough spots over the years, but we should own this within the Jewish community. Islamophobia is something that affects us.
and I think is a souring element, not a good one. It's not, you know, it really is, and it leads Jewish people to be, one of the impacts to be, to approach Muslims with fear and with trepidation and with all sorts of emotions that they don't need to, because it's been a while since we've hung out together in some cases, and vice versa. Right, and vice versa. Sometimes the stereotypes about Jewish people get perpetuated, not just in the Arab world, right? Again, one slice of Islam, but within places where there aren't really that many Jewish people living, or if they they haven't lived there for a long time. That I think is I'm going to just speak about personally, I think to the Jewish world, that's really to our detriment. I mean, I do think that we are two parts of, how would you say, God's family that really could, that could use to spend more time with one another. Because I think when we do, we find out, goodness gracious, there's some really great things that we can do together and learn from one another and vice versa. And yet those hatreds get in the way, not only is hatred directed at us, but those hatreds that we have to own get in the way of us doing more together, which I think would be beneficial to one another as well as to humanity. Can I just share one more thing? Like, it was really cool walking around, like I was at a border area where Ukrainians were coming into Poland, right, seeking refuge in Poland, and there's like a whole lineup of people who were there to greet them. And so one of the first things that I saw was the Egyptian Red Crescent. And about 2 tents down from that was where there was a tent of relief that was there from Israel. Which, again, shouldn't be surprising. Egypt and Israel have been at peace for, the better part of the last 4 decades. But I thought, yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. The Red Crescent right there next to a big, Red Star of David. And yes, right. Look at what we can do when we're working together.
And I want to thank you all for these. Y'all see why these are 2 of my favorite people. I said at the beginning, but this is why, because you all are just wells of knowledge. So you talked a little bit about this in the ways that Islamophobia and anti-Semitism inform and impact how people show up in their own expression of their faith, and how they carry themselves and navigate living life as a Muslim or as a Jew. Can you speak a little bit more about the personal, like the impact of, something that perhaps happens in another community, right? So you hear about a mosque being targeted in another community, or even the getting the mailers. Like, what is one, being a small community within a larger context? I know, just we think about just the U.S. context, right? What is the lingering effect of the reality that any moment, you could be on the receiving end of something that may be happening somewhere else, that it can happen just right here? What's the lingering effect for you on your personal experience, or folks that you may be in contact with?
So on an individual level, it's like I question whether or not I'm being paranoid all the time, when I'm very careful about my surroundings or who's around me, or if someone's looking at me in a particular way. And it's always going in my head, like, am I just thinking that they're staring at me weird? Are they actually looking at me in a strange way? Are they going to do anything? Am I being paranoid and overreacting? But, when the Chapel Hill shooting happened, on our campus of Wake Forest, where, we didn't have maybe 20 to 30 Muslim students, so pretty small population at that time. There were students who you wouldn't see very frequently come to Muslim programs on campus. But when those 3 Muslims were murdered in their home, it touched a nerve, because you're thinking, I'm not that far away. Like, I also live in North Carolina. I know visible Muslims. Someone else might know I'm Muslim. that could happen to me. It just becomes very, real that you are could also be a target. You know, I remember watching on the news when in London there was like a bus or a truck or something that ran into a mosque during Ramadan. And you think, oh my gosh, now we all have to be careful during Ramadan. After the Christchurch shooting happened in New Zealand, I remember going to the mosque that my family goes to in Huntersville, and it's like in this little sort of closed off area, but we had police there. And there was this feeling of like, you don't know who's going to get emboldened by seeing other people do this. Because those people are thinking, well, I'm not the only one who hates Muslims and Jews. Look at all these other people. They went out and they killed them. I can go do the same thing. And that fear, like, I don't know about you, Rabbi Andy, but like, there's no way for me to erase that. No matter how much people are loving, show solidarity, it is always in the back of my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes people, you know, they'll encounter, let's say, security professionals because, you know, maybe they go to a church where you need somebody who helps direct traffic, right? But we need security personnel every time we get together for prayer, every time we have large gatherings, you know, and it's just, I don't like to talk about the details of security, but it's a reality for us. I mean, you know, the same way that you know, the light bill is built into our budget. We have to build pretty significant funds into what we do, and that's, you know, if you take, for example, Temple Emanuel, that we're not the only ones, right? It's not just because we're in North Carolina, but it's every synagogue everywhere. And America is easy. Once you get into the European context, it becomes even more so that people, communities are not open. I mean, you can walk into any cathedral you want to throughout Europe, you know, with no questions asked. To find the synagogue, you have to call, you know, there's a whole procedure that you have to go through just to attend prayers outside of the United States in synagogues. Why? Because this is life and death, and it's very real. And I know, Naijla, you know, that very often, and I think people saw the example of our colleague, Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker in Texas, you know, and most rabbis took a look at that and said, well, that could be me, you know, on any given day or at any given time. You know, I know that I'm a target, and some of the times I just have to compartmentalize and say, well, can't live in fear, going on, and you know, it's all in the hands of God or whatever have you. I hate to put it that way because I don't think God is violent, you know, but at least, you know, that security and that protection. But no, we know it's not just up to God, that we have to do something about it in terms of providing our own security, you know, and we're talking a lot of times about not just adults, but also children. And it's like, why do you have to think that way? Because this is real stuff. And I think you said it so well, I don't need to rabbi-splain it. But you just asked if it's relevant in the Jewish community or if it's something that animates my acting and my thinking, and I think that the answer to that is 100%.
Thank you so much for being vulnerable, honestly, and sharing that perspective. You know, I know that I'm sure there's folks who may in the audience may be able to relate to what you all have shared so openly. So we're nearing our question and answers section of tonight's conversation. And so I wanted to, so it can be really tempting in conversations like this, where we're talking about a topic, to leave folks with, what can you do? Like, what can we do to help you all, or to help stop this? This is wrong, so we want to do something about it, you know? And I know those types of questions, those types of thoughts come from a good place. You know, they don't want people to be in harm's way in their community, or feeling any kind of discomfort or pain, right? But I think it can also run the risk of seeming like we're asking folks who are being impacted and harmed to create the antidote for that as well, right? So before we move into question and answer, I want to you all to, if you have space to do so, or the willingness to talk a little bit about what you would like allies, folks who hope to be allies to the Muslim community, Jewish community. What should they consider before they start to take action? I think you spoke about this a little bit, right? Before, like kind of assumptions you might want to consider. So what do you want to consider if you're an ally who is in the audience tonight, wants to work, be of service, or to help fight hate against the Muslim and Jewish community? And can you also, what should folks consider? And can you provide some, if you have some concrete, a good example of allyship that from your own experience that kind of exhibits what you're describing?
So I think you have perfectly segued into some people's questions, because someone has already said, how can we genuinely support and be allies? So look at Michael, he was just reading y'all's minds. He already knew that that's what y'all wanted to know. Some people ask, what are ways that we can stay up to date? So ways that you can stay up to date on issues that impact our communities is like read about what's happening to Muslims and Jews, read about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. There are lots of resources. NCCJ, I'm sure, has some resources that they can share out with folks. I co-teach a Judaism and Islam 101 session every Thursday with the Jewish chaplain on campus, and that's open to community members. Some of them might be here right now. And so that's another example of like learning and trying to sort of stay up to date. So that's one of my first things, is like ask questions, read sources, educate yourself before you decide to take action on things. And follow the lead of the Muslims in your area. So for someone who's like, how can I support you in real life? I'm pretty sure if you're in any area, there will probably be Muslims nearby you. So find out what it is that they're doing for real in your communities. It's Ramadan right now. This is an awesome time to go to the mosque and eat a lot of really great free food that, come on, like, hello, y'all, free food. And it's like home cooked by somebody, probably from a different cultural background than your own. That is like a win-win-win-win-win situation. And you'll build solidarity and relationships with Muslims. Which reminds me, like, Michael, if you want to come over, anything like that, just let me know. We can make it happen. Rabbi Andy, you're in Poland right now, so we'll have to reschedule that for another time. But, in any case, like, there are people in your community, get to know them.
It's so well said. There's a new book that just came out, if you want to put it on your reading list. The title of it is shocking, and some of you may have read it, but I'll throw it out anyway. It's called People Love Dead Jews. And it's kind of a deep dive into the topic of anti-Semitism, written by an essayist whose name is Dara, D-A-R-A. Her last name is Horn, H-O-R-N. Dara Horn wrote a book called People Love Dead Jews. And as shocking as the title is, it's like, hey, Anne Frank, well, and she wrote some things which seemed pretty optimistic about humanity until you realize that, thank you, Tracy, for putting that in, that, she was murdered at Auschwitz. And there's elements there that really that really are worthwhile for people, again, if you want to look on that subject. But why only focus on the hatred, right? Why only focus on the hatred? So Naijla, I want to lift up just again what you had said, which is like, to get to know the community. Remember, Muslim communities and Jewish communities are going to be focused on a lot of domestic issues. When I say domestic issues, I don't mean like American home, policies, but like it's, working with Jews. That's what I do, right? Working with Muslims. Our job is not to educate the rest of the world, but I think it's good that people are asking the question, well, so how can I take this class or whatever have you? Because I think that comes from a very good place to learn about and to ask the questions. The other thing is, don't look for rationale for hatred. I mean, let me just kind of throw that out there. People will sometimes say, well, why are people anti-Semitic? It's like, ask people who are anti-Semitic. Why people who hate Jews. I don't have to justify their hatred or their behavior. This is terrible. There's no justification for hatred. There is no justification for the things that have been done to Jews or to Muslims over the years. So no, stop looking for rationalizations, but you could look for examples where there has been significant change. Catholicism, for example, used to teach that Jews were to wander the earth stateless. Why? Because of the because of the sin of not accepting Jesus as their savior. That's a pretty bad thing. That got taught for centuries, millennia. It was part of the background of this religious anti-Semitism. And then a major declaration was made by Catholicism in the Second Vatican Council that changed the language on that. I mean, it's post World War II, post Holocaust, but we're talking about over 1 billion people making a change in the way that they think and talk about others. In Judaism, we call that, the word for it in Hebrew is tshuva. You don't have to write that down. It's not going to be on your exam after this meeting with the NCCJ, but it means making the type of significant change so that when you're confronted with a similar problem in the future, you act differently. I saw one of the comments that came out is treat people the way you'd want to be treated. Right? No one wants to be subjected to hate. It's kind of a good principle there. I got to thank my buddy Gene Baruch for putting that in. But I think any of us could say that. The question is like when Jews or Muslims aren't in the room and someone's talking about us, that's almost when you have to say, all right, time for us to slow the conversation down and to watch what we're saying. Because that's when things can really go off the rails. It's not so much, as Naijla was saying, it's not so much, the overt stuff. It's the covert stuff. It's the stuff that gets said when we're not in the room. And I think that, we need voices of people that just, don't try to be holier than thou, but just say, hold on, stop a second. You're talking about people who aren't here and you're making really broad generalizations. Maybe it's time for us to stop or slow this conversation down. Be that person. Be that person, right? It helps. We're always here as resources, or the NCCJ, as has already been referenced many, many times.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, when we were talking before the session, you mentioned a teacher of yours that you had in high school. Can you talk a little bit about that experience? Yeah. I think that's a really great example of allyship that you shared with us. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So in talking about allyship, what I think are good examples is when it proactively comes from you in an effort to ask questions, to relate, to empathize. And so one of my first experiences with this was in high school at T. Wingate Andrews, shout out. And my high school history teacher, Mr. Smith, amazing, wonderful man, decided one year that he wanted to fast during Ramadan along with his Muslim students. He's not Muslim. He was not interested in converting, but it was like, I want to be able to experience what it is you're experiencing and understand what that challenge looks like. And so, just knowing that the teacher valued us enough to decide to share in that experience with us was very empowering at that age. And it was in high school when I started wearing the hijab, which goes to say, like, I had such a supportive community at Andrews that really fostered my ability to do something that was like a life-changing moment for me at that time. And it's what carried me in college when I was dealing with really challenging times of wanting to take off my hijab. And so, I think now I'm in a higher education institution, similarly to Mr. Smith. We're having a Ramadan fast-a-thon tomorrow at Wake Forest, where we have invited our non-Muslim peers and colleagues to fast with us for one day, you know, see what it's like to be working and taking class and doing your real life, going, you know, a little bit hungry and a little bit thirsty. But like, what does that cause you to then reflect on during your day? You know, are you a little more conscious of what you're doing? It makes me think of like mindful eating and the importance of like thinking about what it is you're taking into your body and how you're doing that. You become a lot more mindful during the day when you're fasting of like, oh man, I'm feeling really hungry, or like, I'm very tired, or, you know, how you're acting towards other people. If you're getting hangry, you're like, oh, I'm towing a line of like, I want to get frustrated, but I'm just hungry, so it'll be okay. And then a couple other examples. So I'm a parent of a young child, and I think about how some of our Muslim friends in the area, their teachers like decorated the classroom for Ramadan. Very cute, inclusive way of like, you know, trying to make your young students feel a part of their classroom. My child's teacher asked, like, is it okay for her to participate in the Christmas holiday activities that we're doing? Because she just wanted to be sort of conscious and cognizant of what our boundaries and lines were around that. So yeah, there are really great ways to be allies and supporters. My partner was saying, and you know, Rabbi Andy was talking about when you're building synagogues and mosques in the area, there are plenty of those being built in this area, and there has been backlash against them. So maybe it's participating in like your local government or city council and advocating for these places of worship to be allowed to be built in your area or neighborhoods.
Thank you so much. Great insight, folks. So we're going to open it up for our Q&A. I have some big questions that came through. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Savannah, who's going to ask the first question.
Okay, let's see. We'll start with an easy-ish one, I hope. So what is the difference between being a practitioner of Islam versus a follower of Islam?
Yeah, I saw that Judy asked that in the chat pretty early on. So I identified myself as a practitioner of Islam because I practice my faith. So I will fast or I will pray. I think someone, and I would also say I'm a follower of Islam as well. I'm a Muslim. But there is also now this wide variety of Muslims that identifies like secular Muslims or atheist Muslims, which I know sounds like a contradiction. Again, we'll bracket that conversation. But so a follower of Islam might just be someone who's like, yeah, I'm Muslim adjacent, or like I might still participate in some of these things, but I don't regularly like practice.
All right, so the next question is, how does the intersectionality of religion and other aspects of identity, for example, being a Black Muslim woman or a white Jewish man, impact folks differently within the Muslim and Jewish community?
You want me to jump in?
Look,
Go ahead.
Unless you want me to go first, you know.
You go ahead, Rabbi.
So I have to acknowledge in in Western society that that there's certain things that put me in unbelievably privileged class, right? You know, I am a white man, right? I probably should put myself somewhere in the middle class also, if you want to talk about economics. And yet there's this part of who I am, which is a minority of a minority. How so? America is about 330 million people, and roughly 6 million of us are Jewish. And worldwide, irrespective of our color or our position or anything like that, if you know how they do those infographics and they show 100 people, right? Less than one is Jewish. I should say that if you were just to group, and that you should do this, but group all of Christianity, right, Catholics and Protestants and all points in between and beyond, and all of Islam, 1 out of every 2 people you meet on planet Earth is either going to be Christian or Muslim. We're less than 1 person, so 50 versus less than 1. And so, you know, there are times that we just get completely overlooked, or we get bashed, or we get, you know, we get to play out in somebody else's, you know, conversation about religion or about society or other things like that. And that's a really challenging place to be. I do like when people talk about, you know, Judeo something or other, because at least it elevates us a little bit. Right? Here, I hear sometimes about, and I don't know why they skip over Islam, but they go the Judeo-Christian tradition. We're like, yeah, you're looking mostly at the Christian tradition. That's very nice to put us in there. We should talk about the Judeo-Islamic tradition. That would be really cool, or the Islamic Judeo tradition. But you know, having said all of those things, you know, even to get considered in the same sentence is a very remarkable thing. And I'm playing this, you know, I'm not being coy. I'm playing this very realistically. I mean, we do have a voice, thank goodness. But very often, you know, it means being overlooked. And so whatever power may manifest itself in one direction, you know, gets completely erased in the other direction. I have consciously chosen not to pass, if you will. Part of it you can't see is maybe if I were, you know, because like, look, I have to, America is so based on you know, everybody wants to take a look at what you know, what your visible characteristics are. So I wish I could put this here, but, you know, just like you know, perhaps like a hijab, we could talk about this another time, Naijla, you and me together, but you know, I wasn't born with this. I didn't grow up wearing it, but it was a conscious decision on my part. And part of it, I learned from, you know, being in dialogue with African Americans in college, you know, who were saying, look, you know, you can pass. And I said, well, I guess you're right. But there's also some ways that I don't pass. Look, the moment people find out I'm Jewish, sometimes I have to self-identify. It's like I'm just waiting for the shoe to drop. I don't have to, but sometimes it happens. But, you know, look, I got the big Jewish star on my shirt and I got the helmet. And you know, maybe if I wore the team logo or something like that. But no, it's, you know, but do I have to do that, right? The assumption is that there's parts of all of us, perhaps, that we could talk about where we fit into one category or another category that provides us privilege, and other parts of who we are challenging. I'm going to stop there.
So I really appreciate this person's question, because they very specifically mentioned like Black Muslim women. And recently, in talking to one of my students at Wake Forest, she described she started wearing hijab when she came to Wake Forest. She's a first-year student. Other Black Muslim students at Wake, I think, have experienced something similar, where there is a challenging dynamic of, if you don't visibly look Muslim and you're participating in like the Black Student Alliance, there will be assumption that you're Christian. And there's racism against Black people within the Muslim community, or an assumption that you might have converted into Islam and you weren't born Muslim. And so in both of these communities, there's a really challenging dynamic to hold this intersectional identity of being Black and Muslim at the same time. So yes, intersectionality 100% impacts the experiences that people have within these communities, and then within the other communities that they hold identities for. So I think about like my queer Muslim friend who struggles within the queer community to find validation in their Muslim beliefs and identity because of the assumption that Muslims are all homophobic. And then in their Muslim community, the homophobia that they deal with, and feeling like you need to change your sexuality. And so there are so many ways in which the intersections of these identities are create a multiplicity of challenges that one individual has to overcome. Yes, great question.
Okay, we have another question here. Because December is such a Christian-focused month in America in terms of Christmas, how does this impact you, and what do you wish Christians would start doing and or stop doing?
So this is also a good question. I had colleagues who would email me and be like, hey, how can we incorporate other, religious decorations during December and November. And I was like, oh, that's really nice, except like our holidays don't fall in those months. So you're just going to randomly put up Ramadan decorations. It's going to be December. That doesn't even make sense, y'all. And so the very inherent asking of that question was Christocentric, right? Like I hear the Jewish chaplain Gail talk about how like, you know, Hanukkah wasn't really such a major holiday, but then Christmas. And so now it's a big thing and there's decor everywhere. So I don't think of it as much as like, what can you do differently? I am of the opinion, like, say Merry Christmas. I want you to be able to fully celebrate your holiday the way you want, so that when it's my holiday, I can do that. I should just be going around saying Happy Ramadan to everyone. And right now is the trifecta. We have Passover, Ramadan, and Easter all at the same time. So this is really the season of happy holidays, accurately. That's my take.
Amen.
Okay, let's see. I think we have one more. So can you talk about where the line is between someone doing or saying something that's Islamophobic or anti-Semitic versus someone decrying acts of violence perpetrated by people under the guise of Islam or national defense actions taken by the government of Israel? In short, where's the line between the legitimate debate or criticism and hate?
This is a really excellent question that someone has asked. Because as a Muslim, right, I also feel some kind of way about people attacking this country that I was born and belong to and very much see myself as a part of. And so the line that I see is, are we attacking or are we criticizing and debating about an action? And then the reason why they did that, not assuming that it was just this blanket religion, right? I can point out and be like, okay, so you interpreted this line of the Quran like this and this one like this, and you just erased all these other things that say you shouldn't kill people, right? There's a very different conversation in being like, oh, look at these Muslims. They read this Quran and they just are going to kill everybody that doesn't believe what they do. Versus like really interrogating, why is it that someone would interpret things in that way? What were they taught? Why did they believe that? And then why would they take such heinous actions? I'm not going to go around because of the Capitol riot that happened and be like, look at these white people, these Republicans, these Christians, they just hate all of us and they're attacking our government and this, that, and the third. Like, generalizations are problematic. And so that is where I sort of see the line, broadly speaking, is like, are you attacking the faith, or are you really like looking at the nuances and complexities of why someone has done those things? Because there are legitimate criticisms, 100%.
Yeah, if you want to hear some legitimate criticism, for example, I'll just take Israel. If you want to hear some legitimate criticisms of Israel, just talk to Israelis. I love how many conversations take place about Israel without any Jews or Israelis in the conversation. And sometimes how people cherry pick Jewish people, in order to say, well, this person says it, therefore it must be the be all and end all. We've had to answer this question so many times that we've actually had to come up with a way to walk people through it. We say, look, there are 3 Ds out there. And if you step on any one of these, you're probably an anti-Semite, or at least what you said was anti-Semitic. And, it's going to hurt somebody. Number 1 is demonization. This is the characterization of Israel as, only being interested in killing children and genocide and wiping people out and other things like that. Look, if genocide was the purpose of Israel, Israel sucks at genocide. Okay, we people who have been subjected to it, right, know from these things. But to put things in those terminology, to talk about apartheid and other things like that, is nothing short of demonization. And sometimes it gets characterized in cartoons where you see Jewish people and Israelis looking like they're vampire bats, or they're looking less than human, or like or whatever have you. The second one is delegitimization. And that is looking and saying things like Israel does not have a right to exist. And so it'll be, for example, showing maps that they'll have every country surrounding it. They'll have it referred, the land referred to as Palestine, and there will be no reference to Israel. That's delegitimization. Or showing a map of Israel, again, you can look at disputed areas, but showing a map of Israel that has a Palestinian flag superimposed over the entire thing. That takes away the identity of one of the states, of the United Nations, and really denies any Jewish hold, to the area, or any Jewish part of the conversation. So you have demonization and delegitimization. The third one is double standard, and that's holding Israel to a standard that no other country is held to. If you believe that Ukrainians, it's okay for them to fight back in an unprovoked war, then you might want to have something to say if Israel, for example, is in a situation where unprovoked violence comes its way. Having said that, I realize that there are many sides to conversations, but double standards, you could take a look, for example, at the United Nations Human Rights Council, which over the years has had such wonderful actors as Syria and Russia on it. And wonder, why there have been more resolutions against Israel that have been brought up, to condemn Israel for human rights than any other country in the world, and many other of the world's worst actors combined. That's what we call a double standard. And when you look at that and you try to weigh it all together, it becomes a thing that might do it. And we know that there is fancy terminology out there. For example, saying anti-Zionist. Look, Zionism is the radical notion that Jews are people too. Okay? Because for a long time we were considered as being less than human. This was something where we said, look, we're standing up for our position and our nationhood. And to say, well, I'm against that, is almost like when someone says I'm an anti-feminist, right? Feminism is that radical notion that women are people. And, Zionism is this Jewish self-definition, not from antiquity, but something over the course of the last 150 years or so, in which we said, look, we're tired of being treated as less than human. And we know that the terminology is out there. We just encourage people to watch it when they're using that terminology, because it does not help the conversation, and very often is a one-way, very, antiseptic term in order to try to dismiss what is a much deeper conversation.
Well, thank you all so much. We packed a lot into an hour, and I'm just grateful for your insight, grateful for your sharing and availing us of your knowledge, your great resources and suggestions, and also just being two wonderful people. Naijla, I will be hitting you up for dinner soon. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions. Thank you for your presence here. Be safe, Andy Koren, Rabbi Andy. I am grateful for the work that you're doing, and to know you. I want to say before we sign off that in order for us to continue to have these kinds of conversations in our community, we have to have willing participants like those who are with us tonight and those who are in attendance. We stoke the flames and the fire to be able to do these conversations by informing our young people, our community members about these events. So please, whenever you see the NCCJ flag of programming come up, send folks our way. Also, Anytown, we are actively recruiting for our summer youth leadership camp called Anytown. Go to ncccj.triad.org/Anytown to learn more about how to get your young people involved in that opportunity. So thank you so much. I hope you all have a wonderful evening and be blessed. Good night.